Unfortunately, she had some car trouble, from what I understand, so has not been able to make it. So I am filling in today. So please bear with us. I think this will go very well, though. I'd like to introduce Mr. John Peel, our guest of honor. So how is everyone today on our first day? That's great. So I guess I would ask, how do you feel about Mass right now? With
whatever.
Okay, we figured. Well, actually, if you could hear me pretty well now that I'm seeing with this microphone, it's much better.
That helps, yes.
So I guess because it's been a little wary, I really definitely want to stick to the Mass rule, but at the same time, I know with just personal conversation out in the halls and stuff with Mass, sometimes maybe it's just getting on with age, kind of hard to hear without practically shouting. So I was worried if I should take the mask off, but now that I can hear, I can hear myself very well. I guess this will be good. So if everyone's fine with that, I'll just keep it on.
Yep. If anybody has any problems hearing us, do let us know, though.
Absolutely. So since this is going to be a little different with me taking over with not realizing until about 10 minutes ago, please bear with me. I hope I'll do a good enough job for you as an interviewer. So I guess we should first start off with making sure everyone knows who Mr. John Peel is. He has written numerous books and series, quite a few for Doctor Who, obviously from being here especially, and quite a few other things too, which some I didn't even realize. So I'm really excited to having learned some of that. So I guess with this, today's is more of a all-around who is John Peel and what kind of things he has done in terms of writing. So I guess that's where we should start off with, John, is I know you and I have talked about it a little bit, but how did you really get into writing, I guess, in the beginning?
Pretty much, oddly enough, pretty much through Doctor Who. I was 9 years old when Doctor Who started, so, I mean, really the perfect age to begin. And I began at the beginning. I missed the first 3 episodes, but I came in at the end of the 4th episode, got immediately hooked, and the very next week was the first Dalek story ever. And that just simply confirmed it. I mean, I was just completely sold at that point. And when I was in the habit of writing stories from a very young age, and of course, some of my earliest stories were Doctor Who and the Daleks stories. Like everybody else in England at the time, every other kid certainly, I was fascinated by the Daleks. So I would write little Dalek stories and occasionally try illustrating them very badly. And that's how I really began. Then in the mid-70s, Doctor Who went through the resurgence. It had just had the Pertwee years, and Tom Baker came in. And pretty much as over here, Tom Baker really changed the face of Doctor Who. He made it far more adult in many senses, and brought a lot more people into it. And a group of people who were in London formed the very, well, actually the very second Doctor Who fan club, but the first one that actually expanded to fill most of the country. That was the Doctor Who Appreciation Society, DWAS. And it was basically a group of people who'd all gone to university together in London, and they started DWAS going, and they started up a group. They started a magazine called TARDIS, which is still going, and TARDIS was the fan club newsletter and magazine and whatever. And a friend of mine that I used to write stories with, Steve Evans, said to me, okay, well, why don't we join this group? Because we love Doctor Who, we've been writing Doctor Who stories for years, let's join this group. I'm not much of a joiner, but what the heck? I said, yeah, okay, sure. So we joined up, and they printed a couple of short Doctor Who stories, which I thought were absolutely awful, because they really weren't Doctor Who stories. They were just, I don't know quite what they were really, but they were bad. So I wrote into them, to the editor of the magazine saying, can't you do any better? So he wrote back saying, can you? And I thought, right, yes, I can. So Steve and I sat down, we wrote up a bunch of stories and sent them in to the editor, Gordon Blows. And Gordon really, really liked them. I mean, he really liked these stories. So he decided he was going to publish a special magazine just for these stories, Cosmic Mask, which again is still going after all these years. And what happened then was Gordon contacted us and said, we'd like to do a writers group where people can write Doctor Who stories, send them in and get them published in this Cosmic Mass magazine. Would you and Stephen like to run it? So I said, oh, sure. I mean, again, I hadn't really expected anything like this, so we were completely unprepared, but we had a lot of fun doing it. And then my friend Stephen, he was very good at joining things and starting things and then running out of enthusiasm. So he abruptly said to me one day, I've had enough of this, I'm out, which left me to do the magazine all by myself, which I did for about another 2 years, by which time I'd fallen in love with an American girl and decided to move to New York. So by that point, I'd been contacted by an American publisher who was doing a magazine called Fantasy Empire, which covered English fantasy for American readers. And they had asked me to contribute Doctor Who material to them. And I was doing that. And then at the same time, I was helping with the very first Doctor Who conventions ever, which were being held by the Dwas in London. So I got to meet some of the actors and everything, and got used to them. And I also ran into the editor of Doctor Who Weekly, as it was then, Doctor Who Weekly magazine. And I convinced him that I could write Doctor Who short stories. And he said, well, we do need some backup strips. So I ended up writing 4 of these backup strips with monsters, which was a huge amount of fun for me. Because it's one thing to write a story, but then to see it illustrated by a real artist and turned into a 4-page short comic strip was wonderful. I loved those. And that's really how I got started with any writing. That's how I began.
So Doctor Who actually was your doorway into
Yes,
becoming a
it
professional
really,
writer?
yeah, honestly it was.
Wow.
My first published works were behind-the-scenes things for Doctor Who, and then these short stories, the comic strips, they were my original published works. So Doctor Who got my I got my entry through Doctor Who, which was wonderful because I'd loved the show for so long and everything, and getting a chance to write it was great fun.
Now you're saying you had started watching Doctor Who at 9 years old. So were you one of those kids that they would talk about that's running around the playground as the Daleks? And
Oh yeah. Well, one of the great things about the Daleks is you can impersonate one so easily. You just stick your hands out, and you're a Dalek, and then you just have to learn how to go exterminate, and you're away. That's it. They were very easy to imitate, and they were extremely recognizable. So, you can't imagine it. Literally, every kid in England, pretty much every kid in England was watching Doctor Who, and even the ones that weren't watching it knew it. So, you know, it was a huge cult thing at the time.
And it took off pretty quickly, apparently, from what I've seen. Compared to other
Right.
types of fandom that would be out there with kids, it just seemed like, at least from stories and photographs that you would see, the huge numbers. I mean, there's some very famous pictures, like of William Hartnell out there in just like entire city block, it looked like, of children surrounding him.
Which had never happened before. I mean, literally, there were a lot of shows that kids liked, but nothing at all like this. This was a phenomenon that was created by the people themselves. I mean, the BBC had no clue what was going on, and they didn't know what to do with it or about it. I mean, they were completely unprepared, and it was a full year before they actually managed to agree that people could actually exploit it by producing material based on Doctor Who. Because, I mean, before this, they had not done any kind of merchandising for any show. Because, let's face it, most of the stuff BBC produced was for adults, and a kind of upper-class adult, because they considered it their mission to educate people. There was one famous incident, in fact. There was a show called Vendetta, which was produced by the BBC in around 1969, and it was cancelled very quickly. The reason it was cancelled was not because it was popular, but because it was popular. And the head of the BBC looked at it and said, "That's the kind of stuff that commercial TV should be making, not us."
Wow.
And cancelled a popular show. I mean, can you imagine it? But they were basically snobs. And the idea of all these kids running around playing Daleks, they had no idea what to do about it. They were completely at a loss. It was astonishing. And the popularity of the Daleks was despite the BBC and not because of the BBC.
Now, did you have to fight over whether to be the Doctor or the Daleks, or just everyone decides, we're all Daleks, you can be Doctor? No, I don't want the Doctor, I want to be a Dalek, or...
Oh, kids all wanted to be Daleks. There was no question about it. No, the Doctor was cool, was okay, you know, he was an okay guy, but the Daleks. And, you know, there's a lot of people trying to explain why it is, but I think it's a very simple reason. Daleks are extremely like bad-tempered children. I mean, you know, they are what kids would be if kids had power and no control. They go, you know, I don't like what you're saying, exterminate, boom, you know, and kids would love to have that power, but they don't have it, they're powerless. But it's kind of cool for them to look at the Daleks and say, yeah, I'm with you, mate. You know, we weren't scared of the Daleks. They were not, you know, we never felt they were creatures of evil or anything to be feared or anything. On the contrary, we all wanted to be Daleks.
So then as they evolved, and as you had talked about with Tom Baker, what was your view of when Genesis of the Daleks came out and introduces Davros and everything and really militarizes them, I guess, in a sense? Yeah.
Well, that was because the Terry Nation always saw them as Nazis. Right. Because when Terry was growing up, Terry was probably only about 15, 20 years older than me at the time. So when he was growing up, it was the war, and the Nazis were the bad guys for obvious reasons. So when Terry was thinking of something evil, something bad, the obvious thing is the Nazis, but a science fiction twist to the Nazis. So he always saw them as Nazis, but kids always saw them as bad-tempered children.
Right.
So it was.
So then you had started working with Fantasy Empire. Now, was that Maggie Thompson?
Yes.
Was the editor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know in comic book, in the comic book world fandom, she was quite a name as well, with things like the newspaper, comic book, I'm forgetting the exact name of it now.
Comic Buyer's Guide.
Comic Book Buyer's Guide, was it?
Yeah.
And I remember how that was such a weekly thing, and she was such a lovely woman when I had gotten to meet her a few times. So
yeah, she really helped me, and she backed me up a lot with my work and everything. She was a really helpful lady, and she got me working on that. And then from that, it was a strange process. I didn't even realize that people were looking at me as a kind of authority. It never occurred to me because, as a writer, you sit at home all day writing. You don't interact a lot. And back then, there weren't a lot of conventions or anything, so I didn't meet anybody. All I did was, I was just sort of locked up at home writing. And the first time I actually knew I was having any kind of an impact with my stuff was when an editor from St. Martin's Press called me. And he said, hi, I'm Stuart, and I'm working at St. Martin's Press. I hear you're an authority on Doctor Who. I am? Oh, okay, yeah, I am. And that was the first I actually thought about it. And then Jeopardy called me up one time, which really surprised me. And they were like, hi, I'm so-and-so from Jeopardy. I hear you're an expert on James Bond. I'm like, I am? And they wanted to check an answer with me, which was quite fun. I mean, that was something I had never expected.
Now, from that, sliding a little bit off of Doctor Who, with all these other things that you have written, all the nonfiction material, Doctor Who Files, I remember seeing those, and I know your name was on it, but it never clicked. John Peel did this, and then seeing, you've done other nonfiction works about the making of these different shows. How did that come about for you to suddenly start doing things like that in the James Bond?
Oh, well, that was because of Fantasy Empire. The guy who was publishing Fantasy Empire, Hal Schuster, decided he wanted to stop doing those magazines and do a different kind of thing. And he wanted to do what he called the Files magazines, in which they would each magazine would cover one show specifically, and do it in sections. It would be like a sectional work. And the first thing he wanted to do was Star Trek and Doctor Who, because they're the two biggies, of course, at the time. And he got me working on those, mostly Doctor Who, of course, but originally Star Trek was done by a guy called James Van Hise. But then when James got bored with it, they handed it over to me as well. So yeah, I mean, I was sort of roped in to do those. It wasn't something I came up with the idea for. Right. I did suggest doing The Man from U.N.C.L.E. That was one of my ideas, because I've always been a huge Man from U.N.C.L.E. fan. So when he said, well, are there any other shows we could do? And I said, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. So that one was my idea from the beginning.
Now with these, Star Trek, for example, were you already a big fan of Star Trek beforehand, or did it kind of come with working on those books?
No, I'd not seen it from the beginning, because in England, it was bought by the BBC, because they needed something to actually fill in the time when Doctor Who was off the air. So they bought Star Trek. And we didn't actually get it until it had been cancelled already over here. So we were 3 years behind when we started, and it was a show that was already dead, which is typical of the BBC, of course. And so I had started watching it back then, but I mean, of course, that wasn't anywhere near the beginning of the show. It was at the end. And I'd loved it. I mean, Doctor Who was great fun, but Star Trek had special effects, which was, they could do things that the BBC could not do and had no interest in doing until a lot later, really. They'd done a couple of shows where they'd tried doing spaceships, but mostly they just kind of pretended they didn't exist. And I had gotten into Star Trek from that. And it had always fascinated me. So it wasn't too difficult for me to slip over into Star Trek from Doctor Who. Okay. Only I knew less about it.
Now, when working on the Star Trek novelization, or not novelizations, but the novels, how much leeway were you given? I mean, did you ever meet with Roddenberry, or was it just some of his people and said, well,
Yeah.
here's a basic story idea that we'd like you to do, or was it you threw the idea at them and they had to approve?
I never actually wanted to write a Star Trek novel. That wasn't my idea. What happened was, I was a big fan of Alien Nation. Anybody remember Alien Nation? Yeah, I love that show. I absolutely adored it. And I discovered that Pocketbooks had the rights to do Alienation. So I pushed for that, and I called them up and I said, look, can I do one? And by this point, I'd already done a few Doctor Who's, so they knew who I was, vaguely. Right. And they said, well, we'll talk about it. And we talked about it, and they gave me a script, an unproduced script, and said, can you turn this into a novel? And I read the script, and it was absolutely hysterical. It was really, really good. I'll tell you the plot, basic plot, very simple. Sam and his partner have to go to France to pick up a prisoner. And Sam is terrified, absolutely terrified. And Matt is absolutely hysterical about it. He's going, oh my God, you came billions of miles in a spaceship and you're scared of flying a couple of thousand in an aircraft. I can't believe it. Sam looked at him and he says, billions of miles in a spaceship, yes, but not 1 inch of it was over ocean. And I just cracked. I mean, that's perfect. And I said, yeah, I want to do this. I really want to do this. They drew up the contract and everything, and I was literally 1 day away from signing the contract when they canceled the series. And they were like, the editor called me up, and I, John, I'm really, really sorry, but you can't do that. And I was like, oh. And he said, have you ever considered writing a Star Trek novel instead? And I said, no, because I was annoyed, no. And I thought about it, and I thought, if I was going to do a Star Trek story, what would I do? And there's a lot of rules involved in writing Star Trek, and one of them is no magic. So I thought, if I'm going to do a Star Trek story, I want a Star Trek story with magic in it, because they told me I can't do that, and I don't like being told I can't do something. So I came up with a logical explanation for why there should be magic. And I figured that would get around the rule. So I sent the idea in, and my editor loved it and bought the idea. And then I talked to my friend Peter David. And if any of you know Peter, Peter's written, I don't know how many Star Trek. I mean, I've lost count. He wrote tons of Star Trek. And Peter said to me, oh, you're in for it now. And I'm like, why am I in for it now? And he said, because you've got to deal with Paramount. And he says, and good luck with that one. And I said, well, they can't be all that bad to deal with, can they? And he said, hang on. And he goes to his office, pulls out this letter and shows it me from Richard Arnold. Okay. And Richard Arnold, I mean, this is no joke. I read the letter. Richard Arnold says, this idea of yours, Peter, is merely a complete rehash of stuff we've seen on the TV show already, and it's simply not Star Trek. I mean, what? So he says that's the kind of level of logic you're going to be dealing with. So I was absolutely, okay. So I wrote my story and sent it in. And I'm waiting to get the letter from Paramount about all the million changes they want and everything. And I get a letter from them which basically says, Starfleet is one word. And that was their criticism of my entire novel. Starfleet is one word. So
Very lucky.
Peter was like, "You bastard."
I could just imagine.
So it turned out it was actually one of the most wonderfully pleasant experiences I've ever had.
Wow.
And it was just very easy to do, very pleasant, and a really enjoyable story. So that was cool.
And then you got to expand to some of the other series of Star Trek. I'd say.
Well, yeah. The next one they asked me, they said, Deep Space Nine, we're having problems getting people who want to write Deep Space Nine. He says, we've got no problems. Everybody wants to write the original series. And a fair number want to write Next Generation, but nobody seems to want to write Deep Space Nine. And I said, well, that's a shame, because I love it. I mean, that point, it was my favorite of the Star Treks.
Yes.
So I said, okay, I'll give you I'll do an outline for Deep Space Nine. So I write an outline for what I thought was the most obvious Deep Space Nine story. The Borg find Deep Space Nine. And I wrote this thing, outline called Objective Bajor, with the Borg invading Deep Space Nine. And I sent it to my editor. My editor called me up immediately and said, no, you can't do this. And I'm like, why? He said, you've got to be kidding. The second Paramount sees this outline, they're going to say, no, we want to do that. You can't do it. And they never did a Borg meet Deep Space Nine in all the years. But what happened was, quite amazingly, my editor then said to me, look, there's a better way for you. He says, the story is good. Just change the villain. Create your own. Instead of using the Borg, create your own. So I came up with the idea of the Swarm, with which to just simply replace the Borg. But then, as tends to happen with any writer, I got interested in the idea of the Swarm, and then I wrote more of an outline for them, and then they became more real to me. And eventually, it kind of grew completely away from my original idea. But I was going to write it, and I had this thing about these aliens invading Deep Space Nine, and my editor then wrote to Paramount saying, we've got this idea in progress about an alien race invading Deep Space Nine. And they said, oh, good. Actually, you can give us a hand here. Because this was, I think, season 4. I can't remember. Anyway, the season that was going up with was the one that was going to introduce the new ship. Oh, the Defiant. The Defiant. Yes. They said, we're introducing this ship called the Defiant. Your book will come out about a month before the Defiant shows up on TV. So why don't you have John Peel introduce the Defiant and also some of the other things that we're going to introduce into the first episode of the new season? So the next thing I know is I get the shooting script for the next season of Deep Space Nine in the mail, and a big note saying, absolute secrecy, do not disclose to anybody.
Wow.
And I had to sign my life away saying that I wouldn't tell anybody what I was doing. So they gave me the rundown before it was actually due, and I'm sitting there going, I know what's coming up, and I can't tell anybody. But that was amazing. So instead of actually being a problem to me, Paramount was helping me along in immense ways. So I was really happy.
Did they give you any schematics or anything of what they were going to be doing with the Defiant and stuff to kind of help you with the writing, or just left it to your imagination?
Oh, they just said, well, if you can put the Defiant in, and also mention that the Deep Space Nine is being given armaments. That was the only lead they gave me.
Okay.
And as I say, they sent me the script showing what they were going to do with it. So I had to just explain the background to it.
Okay.
So that was it. But other than that, no, they left me completely to my own devices. They loved it. They were really happy with me. And as I say, Peter was like, why? Why would they be nice to you?
There always seems to be something, though, at least for me, I know, with a lot of the shows, has always been the trope of base under siege concept.
Yeah.
That I've just always thought was fantastic if done right, because I guess I like the claustrophobic feeling or something.
Yeah.
So Doctor Who, that was something I always loved, and so all these other sci-fi shows, I keep going, I want to see a base under siege, because it just seems like it's more intense, more suspense in a situation like that.
Yeah. In fact, one of my favorite books that I wrote for Star Trek was the young adult novel, Prisoners of Peace, which is set entirely on Deep Space Nine. It doesn't go off Deep Space Nine at all. And in that, I was exploring the idea of war is easy compared to making peace. Making war is simple. You know what you're doing. Making peace is difficult because you've got to convince people that what they were doing during the war has to completely change. And I thought, instead of prisoners of war, I had prisoners of peace. And I really liked doing that one because I was trying to write for young adults and saying, look, after the war, what's going to happen? How are people going to be affected, who have been affected by the war? How are they going to deal with it? And that, to me, was a great story to write because it made people, I hoped at least, stop and think about the ideas. So, yeah.
Okay.
But one of the nice things is you can do these sort of things. They allowed me to do them without much oversight.
With some of this then spreading out, then you've done like the young James Bond I had seen and stuff like that. And how did that occur?
Young James Bond. Oh, yeah, well, what happened with that was I'd written Star Trek, I'd written Doctor Who, I'd written my Avengers novel by that point, and I got contacted out of the blue by a company called Daniel Weiss. And Daniel Weiss was a packaging deal, and they built book series around a package deal. And they had the rights to do novels based on an animated show called James Bond Jr. And they thought, oh, well, John Peel's English and everything. He's the perfect person. And they said, would you like to do James Bond Jr.? I'm like, yeah, why not? James Bond, yay, okay. And then the roof fell in, of course, because when you're doing Doctor Who, you have to deal with, obviously, the publisher, which is, at that time was W.H. Allen, and you have to deal with the BBC.
Right.
Mostly, as a writer, I could let W.H. Allen deflect everything from the BBC. They had to deal with them, not me. I didn't have anything to do with them.
They were your shield.
It was the way it was, yeah. When I was doing the Star Trek, I was dealing with pocketbooks and Paramount. And pocketbooks, to an extent, could deal with Paramount as well for me. But when it came to James Bond Jr., we were up a creek because, first of all, the books were being produced by Daniel Weiss, but they were producing the books. They weren't publishing them. The books were being published by Penguin.
Right.
Not only that, there was the animation company, Murakami, whatever, who were producing the show. Not only that, there was Glidrose Productions, because Glidrose were the agents for Ian Fleming, who owned who eventually, when you get down to it, owned James Bond. So I had 4 layers of people to deal with, which is fine if they're all on the same page.
Right.
And they were not by a long way. I looked at it and said, okay, we do what we can with the scripts, because we had to adapt the scripts. I couldn't do an original story. The contract called for me to adapt the scripts. And I don't know how many of you ever saw the show. Probably not, well, actually more than I thought, actually. Okay, but they were not good scripts. They were really, really bad scripts. And I called my editor up at Daniel Weiss and I said, look, how am I going to deal with these? These are terrible scripts. He says, no, John, no. I read the scripts before you do. Those are the good scripts. You should see the ones I'm not sending you. And to prove his point, he'd picked out the scripts that he wanted me to do, the 6 scripts. And then to prove his point, he sent me a box load of other scripts that he had rejected. And I read some of them, and I'm like, oh my God, he's right. These scripts, no matter how bad they are actually better than the other scripts. So I'm shaking my head in amazement at this, and I'm like, oh, all right, I'll do the best I can. And then we start getting the notes. We'll get a note from Murakami, Wolf, Svensson, I think it was, the production company, and they would say, you've got to do it this way. Then I would get a note from Penguin Books say, you've got to do it this way. And then I would get a note from Glidrose saying, if you don't do it our way, they're not being published. And, and they all wanted it done differently. So I'm trying to get my editor to take the other 2 off my back.
Right.
So that I could just get on writing it. But even he couldn't do it because it was juggling so many different companies who all wanted different things. So in the end, it got horribly complicated. And the rules got so stupid. First of all, they said I couldn't use James Bond as a character. He was not to appear anywhere in the books at all. And then the second thing that came out was I couldn't use the James Bond novels as a basis. I couldn't use anything from the novels, nothing. I could only use the James Bond characters and things from the movies because Glidrose owned the books and Eon Productions owned the movies. And Eon was actually licensing the books as well in a deal which thank God I wasn't involved in that part of it, but they came up with the rule that I could only use things from the movies. So I immediately said, oh good, can I use Little Nellie? I don't know if okay. Joe and Live Twice, Little Nellie is this auto gyro, and I just loved it. So when I was doing the books, they said, can I bring Little Nellie back? No. But it's in the movie. No. All right. Then I wrote at one point in one of the books that James Jr. Spots Universal Exports in the background, on the street. And they said, you cannot use Universal Exports, only things in the movies. I said, Universal Exports is in the movies. I said, watch on Her Majesty's Secret Service, right at the very end of the opening credits. There it says, Universal Exports. Oh, all right, then you can do it. Literally, I mean, it was like that. If I wanted to do anything, I had to tell them exactly where it was from before they would say, okay, you can do that. So I wrote the first book, and they said I couldn't use James Bond himself as a character. So I had him sending a series of telegrams, I think, to M, talking back and forth. Then they allowed that for the first book, but they said, don't ever do that again. Oh, well. And no, you can't use M. Oh. So it was just insane. I mean, it was just, they drove me crazy with all of the, you can't do this, you can't do that. And then Penguin Books, in all of their infinite wisdom, decides that the editor who's going to be doing this series is a girl called Tisha. And Tisha I had worked with in the past. And I've worked with about 40 different editors. And she is literally the only one I didn't get along with. So, of course, she's the one they give me. Right. She's a total idiot. I'm sorry, she was. She was a total idiot. And I couldn't talk to her because she made no sense whatsoever. So that didn't help. So by the end of the series, by the 6th book, I was so slap happy. I mean, I was really crazed about the whole thing. And in the last book, the villain is Miss Fortune. And she's this very rich woman with a chauffeur and everything, and she's always driving around in a big car. And I thought, okay, how many of you guys are Thunderbirds fans? Yeah, okay. I thought, this is Lady Penelope and Parker from hell. So I give her, instead of driving around in a normal Rolls Royce, she's driving around in a pink Rolls Royce. I keep doing all these Thunderbirds jokes in the book. I put my wife's father in it. Two of her maiden aunts turn up in it. And I mean, literally, it was like any stupid idea I could come up with went into the book. And right over their heads, didn't see a thing. They were happy with it, so I was happy with it. But it literally is full of stupid jokes, the final book, because I just got so sick of being serious. I just had to.
So how did the family members feel about that when they found that they were in it?
I'm sorry?
The family members, how did they feel when they found out they were in it?
Yeah, they had a great time, yeah. Oh. I did this sometimes, if I had a friend who was a particular fan of one of the series, I would put them in the books. There was a guy in our local post office who was a big Star Trek fan. So I put him in as a character in my Deep Space Nine novel. Oh, God, he came to work one day with like 10 copies and said, will you sign this for me? I'm giving it to all my family. And I'm like, of course I will, But that was cool. But I made him a communications officer, which seemed appropriate for a post person. But yeah.
That's great. Well, for a moment, taking a slight break from the books, to get to know you a little better, would you share how exactly did you meet your wife that convinced you, okay, got to come here to the U.S. and everything else?
I met my wife through Doctor Who. What a surprise, right? Yeah. Doctor Who's been behind almost everything that happened to me in my life in many ways, so I will always be incredibly grateful to the show. But DWAS, which I was in at the time, DWAS was based in England, and they had about 3 American fans who had written in saying, can we do something? Is there something for us?
Right.
And one of the letters was sent to me, and it was from this young lady in New York. And I wrote back to her, and we started communicating that way. And we were pen pals for about 2 years. And then she came over to England for a visit, and that was it.
Oh.
So we fell in love when we met, and that was 40 years ago, amazingly.
and she convinced you to come to the U.S. to stay.
Yeah, she smuggled me out of England into America.
So, and then also, I love the fact a few years back when I started getting to, when I first found out, oh, you're on Facebook, and I'm thinking, oh, John Peel. Oh my goodness, is this the real John Peel that, as a teenager, I've read the novelizations and stuff, and no, this can't be the real John Peel. And I'm checking, it is. Okay, great. And then I started seeing the pictures of your birds.
Oh, the birds.
I absolutely adored seeing that stuff. That I don't know if anyone here doesn't know. He's got this great. That's his family. It seems like just all the birds, and it just surprises me seeing some of the things in the videos that you have.
Yeah.
If you'd share a little bit about that.
It was my wife. I was just at the aquarium here, in fact. Well, we have an aquarium where we are, and they have a little add-on to it, which is a bird room, and they've got parakeets. And these birds are so tame, they come and land on you. And my wife was like, oh, this is the coolest thing. I want some. So she did a bit of research and discovered that lovebirds are very friendly. And we got a couple of them. And of course, being lovebirds, they bred. And we ended up with 18 of them. We started with 2. And they're insane. I mean, they really are. They're insane, but they're tremendous fun. The last lot we had were 5 that were born just over a year ago. And these 5, the mother, Goldie, wasn't a good mother. So we had to take the birds away and hand feed them. And of course, when you hand feed them, they imprint on you.
Yes.
And these 5, I don't know how it happened. Even though my wife was the one feeding them, I was the one that had to hold them in between her grabbing one to feed them, and I would play with them.
Great.
So as a result of which, they imprinted on me.
Yes.
Which means every time we let them out of the cages, whoomp, I have like a hat full of lovebirds. I mean,
Yes.
literally a head full of lovebirds.
Those are fantastic pictures that
And
I've seen.
they walk
there.
all over me, they climb up, they bite my nose, the whole thing. Yeah, it's insane, but it's funny. And my wife will often just let them go and grab her phone and just film them because they do the silliest things.
It looks like Ace Ventura: Pet Detectives. The one scene where in the beginning, first there's no pets. No, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course there's no animals. Door closes, he starts to sing, and suddenly all the animals come flying out. He has his arms out. Birds landing everywhere. So yeah, there's some fantastic pictures
Yeah.
where you're just seeing them right on your head and all over the shoulders. And I was just like, oh my goodness, look at this thing. They're that tame and trained.
Yeah.
I was very impressed.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just hold my hand out and they hop on my finger and I'll go, and they'll nod at me and then fly off. And then they come back and land on me and then they'll start, come on, feed us. They're really pushy. They love millet. They're absolutely addicted to millet. It's like catnip for them. And they harass me until I put the millet in their cages. And then they all go back in their cages and eat the millet. And they're smart enough to know which are their cages and not somebody else's. So it's entertaining every evening, yeah. You never quite know what you're getting out of them. Dickens, our rescue dog, looks at them very warily and goes, oh, all right, and wanders off.
Now, back into the books then. So you've done all these tie-ins with different licensed material, characters, and so on. But then you also have your own original things that I've just been learning about, the Diadem series. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that came about?
Oh, that was my favorite editor. We all have favorites, and Craig Walker was my favorite editor because he and we knew each other's tastes, we knew each other's strengths and everything, and he was one of those people you could bounce ideas off, and you would get a really good response from him. He would see things you couldn't see, and I'd done one series for him in the past, and then he called me up one day and said, would you like to create a fantasy series for me? Basically, like a computer game, which I'm terrible at, by the way. I don't play computer games because I cannot figure them out for the life of me. But he said, he wanted to do a fantasy series based on games. And that was how Diadem came about. I created the whole concept. I saw it as a kind of board game because at least I can figure board games out. So I saw it as like a board game where you move around from world to world within the Diadem. And you have to, like in any kind of a game, you have to move in a certain direction, a certain number of paces and things. And that's how I set it up. Okay. And it was really fun because we were creating an entire concept from nothing. So I would go in and talk to him, and we would bounce ideas off each other, and he would say, okay, if we do this, we could do that, and what have you. And he brought in the great thing about Craig was he worked with everybody. He didn't work as a boss saying, you do this, you do that. He would have, if we had a meeting about Diadem, I'd be there. His assistant would be there. The guy from the art department would be there. The guy from publicity would be there. And we'd all talk, and we'd all know what was going on. So it was really good group effort. The ideas were mine and his, but everybody else was allowed to contribute as they saw fit. And for example, what happened with the series was that when we were doing this, the art director said, you know, these stories continue, right, from book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, and everything, and they're a continuing story. Why don't we do a continuing cover where you can put the books together, and wow. Individually they add up to a bigger picture? And that was because he was in from the beginning, and because he could see how we were going with the story. Then he said, I can use that. So, you know, this was the great thing about working with Craig, because he would do that. And I just loved creating Diadem for him. And then after we'd done that, he called me up one day and said, John, can you write Jane Eyre with dragons? Because he knew what I was like. And he knew just saying Jane Eyre with dragons would get me thinking. So I ended up literally overnight writing a complete outline and sent it to him the following morning. And that was that. That was an idea called The Secret of Dragonhome. And that was probably the most influential book I ever wrote, because so many people have told me that when they were teenagers, this was their book to go to. They loved this book. And I was quite amazed. I mean, I really didn't realize I'd had that much of an impact with it, but it had been. And it was because of Craig again. You know, Craig and I worked so well together. It was just wonderful doing all these books with him. Because, you know, he sort of let my imagination go. He would just, you know, prompt me with an idea and then let me run wherever I wanted to go with it.
There's got to be such a great satisfaction knowing that something original that you've created can have such an impact, not just you know, taking something that's been created by someone else and you get to run with it. And while there may be some of those accolades with that of how, oh, this was great and how you did this and that with the characters we love, but to actually create your own.
Right, yeah. Oh, I love doing it. And knowing that people take to your characters is a tremendously pleasing feeling for a writer, you know, for a writer to be able to, you know, get these accolades from the readers. I mean, I don't care what the critics say, but I do care what the readers say. And aside from making me feel old, I love getting emails saying, you know, I read Diadem when I was in 5th grade. Now I'm sharing it with my children. I mean, okay, it makes me feel old, but at the same time, that they love the book so much that they want to share it with their children. That tells me more than anything that I'm doing the right thing.
Right.
You know, you realize, yes, that's something I'm after.
Now, how about future works? I know you have something that's coming out that we had talked about that I had looked into that I'm kind of excited about getting my hands on. So can you?
Yeah. My latest book is Dracula's Bedlam. What happened was I was contacted by a friend, and he introduced me to Dacre Stoker. And Dacre Stoker is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. And he said, would you like to write a kind of sequel to Dracula? And by a kind of sequel, what they meant was a story which is taking place around the events in Dracula. So the two stories basically coexist at the same time. But the story we ended up writing, actually is more about the peripheral characters rather than Dracula himself. Dracula only shows up for about 10 pages of the whole book. But everything is works around what Dracula did in the Dracula novel. So it's all what's going on around the events, and that was a huge amount of fun, and that was something that we were playing with. I mean, we basically wanted to do a series of shorter stories that fit together into a big whole, and I said at one point, why don't we do a comic strip, a few pages of comic strip story, and we ended up doing 2 of them in the end, where we got a young artist who's really good. He started off not quite knowing what he was doing, but ended up doing brilliantly. And it was just a tremendous experience writing this book, which has literally just come out in England. So a little bit too young for me to actually have copies, I'm afraid, here. I haven't seen it myself yet, but I'm supposed to be getting books in about a week. But that was something I was not expecting to do. That was a lot of fun. And of course, I've been doing the Lethbridge Stewart stories. That was something that they called me up and said, would you like to do a Lethbridge Stewart story? And I hadn't actually written the Brigadier before. And I said, he's probably one of the only characters in Doctor Who I haven't written about. Yeah, I'd love to. And I've ended up doing quite a few of those.
Now with that, did you go back and start watching a lot of the early stories then with Unit to kind of get that feel, or just...
Yeah, they basically started, they follow on from Web of Fear. So, I mean, we basically, they said, go back and watch the Web of Fear and Invasion of the Cyberman invasion story. And the stories will be set in between those 2 stories. So we can do almost anything we want in that period.
Oh, okay.
So it was, obviously, we couldn't use the Doctor. And apart from, and we couldn't use Unit either at that time. We can now. They've got the rights to do Unit now. So they're switching the storyline completely over to Unit. In fact, the last story I wrote was they wanted me to do a short story centered around Invasion of the Dinosaurs. Which was nice, which is fun. We actually couldn't mention the Doctor still, so I just simply, there's a passing reference to, if he, underlined, wants to get involved. And that's as much of a comment as I got away with.
Excellent. Well, yeah. I know we're down to just a few seconds left. So I do know we have 2 more panels with John over the weekend, one tomorrow and one on Sunday. And tomorrow, I think, deals with some of the things like the Lethbridge Stewart items and so on. And then Sunday, we'll be talking about his work on his novelizations for Doctor Who from Terry Nation. So anyway, I guess that's it. Just thank you very much, John, and everyone for spending the time with us. So appreciate it.